So this is a 1956 Cessna 172, the first year. This is up here at S36, and I don't think this thing's flown in a number of years. Pretty ratty. But this is your example. Yeah, look at the headliner, poor thing. No airplanes outside, or have a rough life. Pretty sad. In a lot of cases, people pass away and the families don't claim the airplanes and they just sit derelict. I've read that more times than I can count and heard of that more times than I can count. I don't know the story here. Now here's trivia for you folks. This is a 1958, but not a 172. This is a 175 Skylark. Pretty interesting, huh? I'm not going to get into all that, but look it up. There's our 56 172 and our 58 175. Interesting stuff. The Cessna 172, I'll start with this simply because it's the most produced general aviation airplane of all time. Over 44,000 Cessna 172s were produced as of 2015. Today, it's 2025, and they're still in production in the form of the 172S model. So pretty amazing. The airplane was in production from 1956 to 1986, and then there was a 10-year pause. And then reintroduced in 1996 to the current day. So, and the 172 was developed from the 1948 Cessna 170, which was a tail dragger, and they put a tricycle landing gear on it rather than the conventional landing gear, which is what they termed it at the time. Ironically enough, you wouldn't think of that as being conventional, but there you go, 1948. So the Skyhawk name originally was used for a trim package, but was later applied to all standard production 172s. The early 172s were very similar in appearance to the 170s. The same straight aft fuselage, tall gear legs, and it also had a straight tail fin. Although the 170, it was rounded. The 172A incorporated a revised landing gear and a swept back tail fin, which is where we're at today. So the shift to the tricycle landing gear really revolutionized general aviation because it just made it much easier for ground handling, made it more appealing to novice pilots, for people that were training, and thus today has become a very, very popular, if not the most popular trainer for new pilots. Of course, over the decades, the 172, it's had numerous updates and variants. We'll get into the variants as we go forth. And today, just like it was when it was introduced, it's used not only for training, but as a family airplane, and they're outfitted for all kinds of other uses, Civil Air Patrol, camera rigs, you name it. A very, very versatile airplane, very fuel efficient. It has a decent payload and a decent cruise and range for what it is. So currently, as of today, the 172S model, which is what is in production, it's got a Lycoming IO360, develops 180 horsepower, has a fuel capacity of 56 gallons, a cruise speed of 124 knots, a range of 640 nautical miles at 55% power. The service ceiling is 14,000 feet. Gives you a climb rate of 730 feet per minute. Not too bad. It has a stall speed of 40 knots in the landing configuration, 48 clean. Rotation speed is 55 knots, and best angle of climb, 62 knots. Best rate of climb, 74 knots. Safety record-wise, the 172 is considered one of the safest general aviation aircraft ever built, due to its stable design, very predictable, predictable handling, forgiving stall characteristics. It's really a docile airplane. We flew one for a period of time when my dad ran the 310 off the end of the runway. We had to put a new right wing on it. So anyway, we've got a little bit of time in an old 172 back in the 70s.
Tell us what you remember about flying the 172.
Well, I started getting checked out in the 172 when I was getting overhauling my engine on my old 310. And Walt Rupert, who had a FBO in Beaverton, Oregon at that time, checked me out in his, and I kept it at my house on Olinger Field. And it was an easy airplane to fly, it started easy, no problem, and I already had high wing experience in a tri-pacer. Good visibility, and easily handled on a 2,000 foot grass field. So I'd flown it all over the place and just cut holes in the air with it, and then used it on business for a little bit. And it was nice, easy to get in and out, and when it rained and you had something over your head. Though the only thing about a high wing, which I didn't like that well, is when you're on base and you turn to base, the wing hides the airport as you're coming around, and then you open up and you turn on final. Of course, it's fine from there on in, and it lands pretty easy, slow, about 145 knots or so. You can touch down at
45 knots.
Yeah, 45. 145 is a little. It's never seen 145. I think flies at about 130 to 135, and pretty efficient on the fuel. Gear hangs down here, and don't have to worry about getting the gear down any of that like you do on a 310 or a Baron or any of those. And this one I particularly had pretty old-fashioned equipment on it. It was used as an instructor by Robert Rupert, and so he wasn't using it that much, so I just kept it at home for probably 3 or 4 months. And then whenever I was having to fix my airplane and needed to go someplace, I'd find myself on 172. Easy to fly as they get, and smooth, fairly efficient. And can't remember what I was getting gallons per hour. I think it was something like 7.5 to 8, something like that. And so easy to work on. The only problem was fueling the things. You had to climb up on the step or get a ladder or something, fill the wings up with fuel. But other than that, it's a nice, good little airplane.
There's a bunch of them out here.
Oh yeah.
Even got a 172 float plane over there.
That's not a 172, is it?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, like with any airplane, the 172 has to be respected. So there's certain things that you would want to avoid in a 172. Is one of those being aerobatics. So those are prohibited. Spins, although the 172 can recover from spins, they're not part of normal operations and require, you got to know what you're doing if you're messing with that. So that would be avoid potential dangers. So spins, not a good idea. Obviously, high density altitude. This is a normally aspirated airplane with not an immense amount of power. So you got to pay attention to that. So now we're going to get into the variants, but one interesting note on the 172, there was a world record set in 1959 in a 172 where it literally flew. It was being refueled, but it flew for 64 days, 22 hours, being refueled in the air, which is a world record for flight endurance. I can't even imagine. But anyway, that's an interesting one for you. It covered an approximately 150,000 miles, and which would have been obviously 6 times further than flying around the world at the equator 6 times. So that's pretty crazy. Okay, variants. So in 1955, for the 1956 model year, that was the first production year, and that 172 was just model 172. And at that time, that airplane had 145 horsepower, and it had a Continental O-300, a 6-cylinder air-cooled engine. And then in 1957 through 1959, there were just minor changes. The 59 introduced a new cowling to improve cooling. And so from 1956 to 1959, there were close to 4,000 built. So the major change in 1960 for the Cessna 172 was very, very obvious, and that was the swept-back tail design. So this made the airplane obviously give it a modern look, and very, very significant, because even to this day the airplane looks modern because of that. In 1961, the 170B was introduced, and it had a shorter landing gear, lengthened engine mounts, a reshaped cowling, a pointed propeller spinner, and it did have a gross weight increase. Also had a wider and rearranged instrument panel located a little bit further aft in the fuselage. The Skyhawk name was applied to an available deluxe option package at that time, and that's where the Skyhawk name was first introduced. This deluxe package included optional wheel fairings, avionics, and a cargo door, along with full exterior paint rather than partial paint stripes. It was also powered by an O-300D in place of the O-300C. 989 172Bs were built. In 1962, the 172C was introduced with fiberglass wingtips, had redesigned wheel fairings, had a key starter to replace the previous pull starter, and an optional autopilot. The seats were redesigned to be six-way adjustable, and the child seat was made optional to allow two children to be carried in the baggage area. Little over 800 of that variant were built. The 172D, introduced in 1963, had a cut-down rear fuselage with a wraparound OmniVision rear window, a one-piece windshield, had increased horizontal stabilizer span, and a folding hatch shelf in the rear cabin. Did have a gross weight increase to 2,300 pounds, and it would stay that way until the 172P. The 172E, introduced in 1964, had a redesigned instrument panel and center-mounted avionics and circuit breakers, replacing the electrical fuses that had been in the previous models. A little over 1,200 of that variant were built. The 172F, introduced in 1965, had electrically operated flaps to replace the previously lever-operated system and improved instrument lighting. 1,400 of those were built. And the 172F also was used by the U.S. Air Force as a primary trainer, and that was used during the 1960s and early 70s as an initial flight screening aircraft in the U.S. Air Force undergraduate pilot training program. After that program, these aircraft were then reassigned to the U.S. Air Force Academy for the Cadet Pilot Indoctrination Program, and then some of the other ones were distributed to Air Force Aero Clubs. In 1966, the 172G came out. The model year had a longer, more pointed nose spinner, and ironically enough, it sold for $12,450 in its basic format, basic version. You could get an upgraded one for $13,300, and there were close to 1,500 of those built. The 172H, 1967 model year, had a 60 amp alternator replacing the generator, a rotating beacon replacing the flashing unit, redesigned wheel pants, a shorter stroke nose gear, and that helped to reduce drag and also was an appearance item. A new cowling was used, introducing shock mounts as well that transmitted lower noise levels inside the cockpit, reduced cowl cracking. The electric stall warning horn was replaced by a pneumatic one, and nearly 1,600 of those were built. And these model years went right along, and they were just updating this airplane on a regular basis. The 172I, 1968 model, and that was the first start of the Lycoming powered 172s, and it had an O-320E2D. It had 150 horsepower, a 5 horsepower increase from all previous models. And that increase resulted in an optimal cruise of 130 miles an hour. There was really no change at the sea level rate of climb, which at that time was 640 feet per minute. And the standard and deluxe Skyhawk models were no longer powered by different engines. So The 172i introduced the first standard T instrument panel arrangement as well. The 172J, which also came out in 1968, that it had been a planned replacement of the 172. This was the Cardinal, the 177. So this newly designed airplane called the 172J featured the same general configuration, but if you know what a Cardinal looks like, it had a strutless wing, a cantilever wing, and a more raked windshield. It was much more stylish. A single 172J prototype was built at the time, but the popularity of the previous 172 with Cessna dealers and flight schools prompted the cancellation of this airplane. And so it ended up going on to be its own model and became the 177. So kind of an interesting little history there. So the Cardinal was going to be the new 172 that wasn't. 1969, the 172K was introduced. It had a redesigned tail fin cap and reshaped rear windows, and those windows were enlarged. It also had optional long-range fuel. 1970 model year featured fiberglass, downward-shaped conical camber wingtips, and optionally full articulated seats. So over 2,000 of those were built between the 2 years. So this is 1969 and 1970. In 1971, the 172L was introduced, and there were a few changes here. They went to a tubular steel landing gear that replaced the original flat springed legs, and they did increase the width. So because the landing gear was wider, it was a little bit bulkier. In order to maintain the same performance, it would require you to have the aerodynamic fairings. And it also had a nose-mounted landing light, had a bonded baggage door. It also had optional cabin skylights. And then in 1972, now this is the same model, still the L model, but they did introduce a plastic fairing between the dorsal fin and vertical fin, and they wanted that to look, have more of a resemblance to the 182s at the time. And they also had a reduced diameter propeller, bonded cabin doors, and improved instrument panel controls. And there was over 1,500 of these built. In 1973, the 172M came out, and it had what they called a camber lift wing with a drooped leading edge for improved low-speed handling. It had a key-locking baggage door, new lighting switches. Then in 1974, which this is still an M model, they introduced the Skyhawk 2, which was sold alongside the baseline 172M and Skyhawk models with higher standard equipment. So it basically had a second navcom, an ADF with a transponder, had a large baggage compartment, nose-mounted dual landing lights. 1975, they introduced shoulder harnesses and an improved instrument panel and door seals. Then in 1976, once again, this is still a 172M, they stopped marketing the airplane as a 172 and exclusively began using the name Skyhawk. This also had a redesigned instrument panel, which held more avionics. The fuel and other small gauges were relocated to the left side for just ease of the pilot compared to the earlier 172 panels. Now, the 172M, there were over 6,800 of these built. So that is a ton. 1977, the 172N was introduced. Now, the horsepower improved here to 160 horsepower, and it was a Lycoming O-300 H2AD engine, and it ran on 100 octane fuel. So there was also a name that they termed this as the Skyhawk 100, because all previous engines had used 80 or 87 octane. At the time. And other changes, they had a pre-select flap control and optional rudder trim. Then in 1978, which this is still a 172N, they had a 28-volt electrical system in place of the previous 14-volt system added, as well as optional air conditioning. Then in 1979, on the 172N model, they increased the flap extension speed to 110 knots. And over 6,400 of these were built. So this is really the heyday of general aviation when you look at those numbers. Then there was no 172O because they didn't want people to think it was a zero. So they had so in 1981, they had a 172P. And so this is the introduction of that. And this had a Lycoming O-320 D2J engine that replaced the previous model, which had been proven to be unreliable. So that's not good. And then other changes to the P: decreased maximum flap deflection 40 degrees to 30 degrees to allow a gross weight increase from 2,300 pounds to 2,400 pounds. And a 62-gallon wet wing and air conditioning were also something you can get optionally, so increasing fuel capacity by 10 gallons. The 82 model year moved the landing lights from the nose to the wing, and that increased bulb life. And then in 83, they added some minor soundproofing and thicker windows. 1984 introduced a second door latch pen, a thicker windshield and side windows, additional avionics capacity, and low vacuum warning lights. Over 2,600 of this model was built. So 1983 introduced the 172 Cutlass. Now, it was given the name Cutlass to create an affiliation with the 172 RG, which is a retractable geared 172. So really, this was just a 172P, but with a Lycoming O-360 A4N engine of 180 horsepower. We're going up another 20 horsepower. It also had a gross weight of 2,550 pounds and an optional cruise speed of 122 knots compared to the 172P's cruise speed of 120 knots. It had a useful load that was about 100 pounds more than the Skyhawk P and a rate of climb that was actually 20 feet per minute lower due to the higher gross weight. And then there was a Cutlass 2 that was offered as a deluxe model. And they called it the Cutlass 2/Nav Pack with IFR equipment. So basically an IFR platformed Cutlass. And that was produced alongside the 172P for 1983 and 1984. And that was a kind of a shortly lived model with that name. Now, this is where we have the pause. And so from between 1986, or actually we should say 1987 and 1995, no 172s were produced. Then in 1996, the reintroduction of the 172, the 172R Skyhawk R came out. It had a Lycoming IO360 L2A with a maximum horsepower of 160 on 2,400 RPM. And this was the first Cessna 172 to have a factory fitted fuel injected engine. So this is really a big deal. So now we've got a fuel injected engine. So that's where the I in the engine comes from, IO versus O. This model year introduced a ton of improvements: new interior, soundproofing, all new multi-level ventilation system, standard 4-point intercom, all new avionics, new seats, new vertical and reclining adjustments, new harnesses. So a lot of new equipment, as you can imagine, because of the big period of time there where nothing was produced. And then in 1998, the 172S, which is basically what we have today, was introduced, and that was powered by an IO360 L2A of 180 horsepower. And the maximum engine RPM went from 2,400 to 2,700, which gives you that 20 horsepower increase over the R model. And so the maximum takeoff weight was increased. The model is marketed under the Skyhawk SP name, and that is where we're at today. Now, the avionics platform of this airplane, it's all Garmin, and and as of 2025, this is just as popular as it's ever been. Of course, the numbers aren't what they used to be at one time, but we could actually see that increase just based on the number of pilots that are needed throughout the world. So as of 2025, the 172 comes with the G1000 NXI, which is a heck of an avionics platform. And we did go over the specifications for standard, standard fuel and range and all that kind of stuff. But a fabulous airplane. I hope this kind of gives you some insight on it. And We'll see you on the next one. Thanks for hanging out.